We're going to get cranking here on our Abraham series. It's the next 10 weeks. We're going to be working through this story of Abraham. And I was talking to Rachel this week. I've been struggling a little bit with it. And part of the reason is because I had a little bit of an Easter hangover that I'm still trying to get over here, because it was a big, rousing weekend. And as I've been thinking about Abraham, one of the things that's actually been locking me up is how significant of a story the story of Abraham really is. And the more time I spend around it, and the more time I'm reading the context around it, and the import that this story has, the more tied in knots I kind of got in figuring out what is the way through this story? How do we talk about this in a way that really helps us to understand what's going on? And actually, the thing that I came to is an image that I want to put before you that helps us understand where this story is born out of and maybe give us a little context. So I want you to imagine with me for a second that you're part of the Israelite people that have just left 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Generation upon generation upon generation, some 20 or 25 generations of your past ancestors have lived and been in slavery there in Egypt over this time. And at some moment, a man that you have come to learn is named Moses, comes to town, and he says that the God of the universe loves you and your family and has come to rescue you. And then you watch him punk Pharaoh over and over again until the greatest ruler on earth releases you, hey guys, releases you out into the desert. And now you are with a tribe of hundreds of thousands, maybe a million people that are wandering through the desert. And at night, you gather around the campfire for history time with Moses. Because you got a lot of questions. And the questions are, who are we? And why does God care about us? And who is he? And how did we get here? And why did he call us? And what is the plan? And where did we come from? And Moses begins to tell them the story of how the history of their people came to be. And you can imagine the crackling fire and the blazing stars overhead, where night after night after night, the elders of the tribes have gathered together, and Moses is telling them about how they got here to this place. What we're going to actually start with is a good old-fashioned origin story. It's very popular in the modern storytelling era to talk about origin stories, particularly if you're a fan of comic book movies. You know that when they're going to show you a new Spider-Man movie, at some point in that movie, there's going to be an irradiated spider that's going to bite the kid so that you can understand how did he become part man, part spider. If you're watching one of the 14 Batman reboots, at some point, little boy Bruce Wayne is going to watch his parents get gunned down by a thug in an alley. It's just going to happen. This summer, there's a new Superman movie coming out. And I guarantee at some point, a little baby Superman gets shot in a little ship and flies across the universe and crash lands here. It happens in every single one. Right now, Rachel and I are really geeked up watching Andor, which is a prequel story about how did the rebellion get started, because we want to know, where do these things come from? Where do we come from? Maya Angelou, who's a wonderful American philosopher, let's call her, she says this: if you don't know where you're from, where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And if you can just take that picture and see this massive humanity that's been sent out of Egypt, and now they're in the desert, and what they're wondering is, where did we come from, and where are we going, and what is this? What is our origin story? What does this actually look like? And this is a significant origin story. It's not just something that's important in the Bible. It's not just an ancient story. In fact, if you've been around the church your whole life, right before the previous service, I had one of my friends who's here, an older guy, he said, are you going to get up there and lead us through a song of Father Abraham? Now, a few of you chuckled, which means you're an old school church person and you've been around and you know that we sing goofy songs about Father Abraham and his many sons. If you're newer to the church, you might have barely even heard of Abraham. And in fact, I'm going to confuse you right off the bat, because I'm going to talk about him as Abraham, and the text is going to talk about him as Abram. But there's a reality that this story is an incredibly complex, deep, and impactful origin story. In fact, over 50% of the people currently living on earth tie themselves to this origin story. Google tells me that something like 8.5 billion people currently exist on the planet. And by doing the math, I figured out that it's over 4.5 billion of that 8.5 billion people say that this is their origin story. Yes, some 15 to 20 million Jews. Abraham is our guy. Another 2 billion Muslims look back and say our origin story starts right here with this guy, Abram. And 2.5 billion Christians around the world also say this is the guy that our origin story begins with. This is arguably one of the most important stories in human history. And part of what has overwhelmed me with trying to figure out how to come at this is the import of that sits on top of it. And yet we can oftentimes, with stories that we're familiar with, just kind of go through the beats and know how it works. And I want to try to avoid that. So we're going to work on it today. And we're going to do that by actually talking about how the story gets here. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 12. So if you have a Bible with you, you can be ready to go. We're going to cover the first 9 verses of Genesis 12. But in order to do that, it's helpful to know what is the origin story of the origin story. Here's what one of the commentaries I've been using in my studies is by an Old Testament scholar out of England. His name is J. Goldingay. He says this: Genesis chapters 1 through 11 portrays humanity deciding to make its own destiny without reference to God. He summarizes these first 11 chapters in your Bible that precede the story of Abram and says what it's telling is the story of humanity doing it alone. So just to help you get up to speed, the story of the Bible starts off with God creating everything, including humanity, and then very quickly transitions to that humanity, Adam and Eve, deciding through deception brought by Satan that it would actually be better if they took control of their own life and their own destiny rather than trusting in God. And then they are exiled from the Garden of Eden. That's the first 3 chapters of the book. And following that is the story of Cain and Abel, their sons, who now living in this new environment where they're making a name for themselves, they're defending themselves. Murder comes onto the scene almost immediately. And the stories that follow is the rollout of what I have titled the expansion of chaos. What happens when humanity lives under its own rule and pursues its own good at all cost? What we see is chaos. In fact, it leads to a moment just a few chapters into the Bible where God looks at his creation and the humanity that he gave his spark of life to, and he says, this was a massive mistake. This was a huge problem. In fact, I'm going to wipe them all out. And he almost ends the human line, but for a man named Abram, who he sees and says is righteous. And he saves him through this cataclysmic flood that wipes out humanity and restarts with Noah. And then Noah barely gets out of the boat before the expansion of chaos begins again. And it all culminates in Genesis chapter 11, which is recorded as a story that we know as the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel tells the story of humanity trying to make a name for itself and build a massive tower to the heavens. And it's at the backdrop of all of that that we get the story of Abram. In fact, this is what he says as he continues. He says in Genesis 12, something shifts. God takes the initiative towards one person, Abraham, initiating a relationship designed to draw Abraham and his family into the destiny God desires for them, which will eventually embrace the entire world. The story that we are seeing here and that we're going to spend the next couple months with is the story of how God chose a man and his family in order to begin the redemption plan for all of the universe and all of the world. It's an incredible story. But before we get into Genesis chapter 12, I'm actually going to back up just a little bit to the section that comes right before it, right at the end of Genesis chapter 11. You can follow along with me if you want. It's one of these classic Old Testament sections of text where a bunch of people with weird names get laid out. And so in order to make it easier for us to understand, I have a little family tree up for us. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to kind of walk us through the family tree. Here's what it says. This is starting in verse 27 of chapter 11. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Just for pause, we've been saying Abram and Abraham. There's going to come a point in the story in the next couple of weeks where we find out why we call him Abraham instead of Abram. But for now, that's the same guy. His name gets changed later. God likes to do that. We'll talk about it. But when you hear Abram or Abraham, it's the same person. Terah has 3 boys, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's a city, Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both got married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Okay, so that's where I'm going to give you a picture. So here we got Haran dies, and his son Lot and his daughter Milcah are there. And one of the boys, Nahor, marries his niece. I know that sounds very weird. This is 4,000 years ago. The rules were different back then. That was a very common thing. I'm not advocating for any of this. I'm just explaining what it's telling us. And then it tells us that Abram gets married to a so far unknown character named Sarai that he marries. And this is what it says about her. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. So here's what we see. A man named Terah has 3 boys. One of them dies an early, untimely death, leaving behind his son Lot and his daughter Milcah. Milcah gets married off to one of the boys, Nahor, and Abram takes this woman, Sarai, as his wife. And here's what we know about her. We know she's real pretty. That's going to come up in the next part of the chapter. And we know she can't have kids. And it tells us that Terah makes a decision to move, and I assume that Nahor and Milcah stay behind in Ur with the family ranch, and Terah, for whatever reason, although the text does not tell us why, packs up his boy and his grandson and their families, and they move on. And it says they go from Ur of the Chaldeans up to Haran. So let me just give you a map so you can see what that looks like. The area of the world that we're talking about right now is what you would know as modern-day Iraq. So if you can imagine the world map and where I know everybody's like, that helped me zero. Okay, so just as an idea here, we have the Persian Gulf, we have the Mediterranean Sea. This would be Egypt over here, and then down here is what we would currently know kind of as Saudi Arabia. And up here at the top of the Persian Gulf is the place called Ur of the Chaldeans. And what it says is their family takes off up the river valley and ends up settling in this place called Haran. The text tells us, for whatever reason, that Terah was going to go to Canaan over here. But on the way, he stops and settles in Haran. That's what the text tells us. That's where the story is. They are, for whatever reason, a fairly nomadic people, it seems like. They're willing to go on an adventure and to settle themselves in a new land. And this is where Abram and his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot have went off with the old man to start a new life in the place called Haran. And it's against that backdrop that the text opens. Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Here's what the text says. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. This is what's a little bit crazy to me about this story. It tells us the history of the earth up till the Tower of Babel, and then it says, and then a bunch of people lived and had kids and lived and have kids, and it's this long line until it gets to Terah's family, and then it gives us more detail, and then suddenly God speaks to Abram. It doesn't even tell us how he knows Abram. It doesn't tell us about any relationship that they have pre-existing before this. All it says is that Abram speaks to God, or more accurately, God speaks to Abram. How does he do that? I have no idea. I don't know if he hears an audible voice from the sky. I don't know if he feels something in his heart. I don't know if he has a dream where God speaks to him. All I know is that Abram hears from God, and God says, I want you to do something. I want you to leave your country, your people, and your father's household. And where am I going to send you? I'll show you. Head on out. The call that he gets this is significant. The way that it's laid out is significant because it goes at all of the defining characteristics of a man or a family in ancient Near Eastern culture. He says, I want you to leave your nation, I want you to leave your tribe, and I want you to leave your family. These are the things that defined who you were and what you valued and what the boundaries of your life looked like. It's true of us. If somebody said, if God came to you in a message and said, I want you to leave the United States, I want you to leave your church, I want you to leave your family, you would go, that's everything I know. This is my home, this is my culture, this is what I value, these are my people, and this is my family, and you're telling me you want me to go? Where? I'll show you. This is a significant call from God to leave behind everything that he knows. The story of the Tower of Babel that was just in the previous chapter, this is the key verse, I think, in the entire thing. What it tells us is that the people in Babel, which is another way for saying the city of Babylon, most likely, they said this, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. And God judges them and he confuses their language and he spreads them out because if you remember when we talked 2 weeks ago in our sermon about being a missional church, one of the things we talked about was the prime directive of humanity given at the very beginning was to be fruitful, to multiply, and to subdue the earth. And what they have said is we will gather together in one place, not go out, we will gather, and we will do what we want to do, which is to make a great name for ourselves. Now, if I'm writing the Bible, this is the part where my God character that I'm writing says, it's bad to want to have a name. You shouldn't try to be great. But God doesn't do that. In fact, what he uses is the desire that every one of us has to be significant, to be important, to have a name, to have a purpose, to have a mission. And he says the issue isn't that you want greatness. The issue is how are you going to achieve your greatness? And what the people in Babel said is, we'll get together and make a name for us, for ourselves. And God says no. That same commentary says this, when Abram gave up his place in his father's household, he forfeited his security. He was putting his survival, his identity, his future, and his security in the hands of the Lord. He doesn't say you shouldn't want a name and you shouldn't want to be great. He says, who will give it to you, you or me? In fact, this is what he says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great. All the things those people in Babel wanted, God says, I will give it to you. I'll be the one that make that happen for you. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you. God comes to Abram and he says, I'm going to ask you to leave everything you know to ascend you to a place that you cannot envision. And what I'm going to do to you in that place is I am going to become a God who will make you great. In fact, when people from here on out think about what it looks like to be blessed by God, they're going to use you as the reference point. Ancient people from all over the world will point to Abram as being the example of what it looks like to be submitted to God and have him bless you. Robert Alter, who's a Jewish scholar, who's done a bunch of translation and commentary work, especially in Genesis, he says this, after the string of curses that begin with Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, human history reaches a turning point with Abram, where blessings instead of curses are emphatically promised. The expansion of chaos that the early chapters of the Bible tell us that bring curse into our relationships, into our culture, into our world. God suddenly comes to Abram, an individual man, and he says, for whatever reason, I am choosing you, and I'm going to bring blessing to the world through you. That's the story that Abram tells. And lest we forget, although we can, I think we can empathize with the idea of leaving our nation and our tribe and our family. One of the things that's unique about Abram's call to leave that's hard for us to understand is the call to leave the national gods, the tribal gods, and the family gods that would have influenced Abram's life. We live in a world where there's really seemingly two legitimate options. I was just talking to a friend between services, and he talked about a conversation that he was going to have with someone in his family. And they're an atheist and he is a Christian. And that's really kind of the options that it seems like we have in our modern day. You either believe in God or you don't. In Abram's time, you would have been in a polytheistic world where many, many gods are considered real and worshiped. And you would have had layers of gods that you submit to. There would have been national gods that the Chaldeans would have worshiped, many of them. And then your tribe, the area in which you lived, would have had regional gods in which you worshiped. And your family would have had ancestral gods that just belonged to you and your family. And when your ancestors died, they went and hung out with those gods. And so when God says you need to leave your place and what you know, it's not just about land, and it's not just about property, and it's not just about family. It's about leaving the gods that have dominated your way of viewing the world. Because what it does is it opens up the possibility for one God to step in and fill all of these needs among Abram as a solo person. And the reason we know that this is so significant is because a couple generations, well, no, actually, this is some 400 to 500 years later, Joshua says to the Israelite people as they're getting ready to go take the land, here's what he says. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and established him here in this place. This is a massively significant part of the story, leaving behind the gods of the world he knew to go into the land that the God that has come to him will give to him. So what does Abram do with this? God has spoken. He says, I'm taking you somewhere you don't know. Abram went. I love that. It's so simple. So what did he do when God spoke? He did it. Abram went just as the Lord had told him. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set off from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. The story tells us that when God speaks to Abram, he does not hesitate, he acts, he responds, he moves. And it is not an insignificant move. When Rachel and I got married, I had a U-Haul come to my parents' house where I was living at the time and pack up my tiny little bedroom that had nothing in it. If I was telling the story of our migration to Arizona, it would not include packing up the U-Haul because it's not a very impressive part of the story. Abram's story gives us a picture of what was going on. This dude has been successful. They have many possessions. They probably have lots of goods, tents, animals. Not only that, they have acquired people. Now, that's a very uncomfortable statement, but the reality is their families have expanded. They've hired people, and they probably have some version of slaves that they have picked up along the way that would have been normal in those days. And when they set out, they have a massive caravan of people taking off for this place called Canaan. Now, lest you think this is a 30-mile journey down the road. This is 500 miles southwest of where they are right now. And they have to pack all this stuff and head out. I love this in Hebrews, when the writer of the letter of Hebrews in our New Testament talks about Abram. Here's what it says, and I think it encapsulates it very well for us. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to the place he would later receive as inheritance, he obeyed and he went, even though he didn't know where he was going. It's one thing to be promised a new job when you move across the country. It's another thing to feel called to move across the country and not have any idea what you're going to do when you get there. And the reality of what he hears from God when he comes into his life is, I want you to leave everything you know, pack up everything you have, and go to a place that you don't know. And I'll bring you there. So just as a reminder, what we have is we have Nahor and Milcah stayed behind in Ur on the original ancestral family plantation or whatever they had out there. In Terah, the old man stays behind in Haran, and Abram and his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot take off and they head towards Canaan. This is the question I keep wrestling with. Why did he bring Lot? God doesn't tell him to bring Lot. There's nothing in the plan that says, and make sure you bring him along. And yet, it very clearly tells us he brought his wife, his nephew, and all the stuff that they had. And I've spent a lot of time this week trying to think about what is the reason that you would bring Lot. And I think the reason he brings Lot is the reason we do a lot of things in our own lives. How often do we want God to solve our problems in the same way that we would solve them? Here's the promise that God makes to Abram. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. And here's what Abram knows. I have a wife who's lovely, but she can't have children. So Abram does something incredible. He believes God, but he also has a plan for how God's going to pull it off. He says, well, obviously God's going to do what he said he's going to do, and I know how he's going to do it. He's going to do it through my nephew Lot, so let's bring him along to make it easy for God. And how often do we do that in our own lives? We believe that God will provide for us, and yet we don't wait to see how he's going to provide for us. We build an elaborate plan of how God obviously will do it. And what we're going to see in Abram's life is a transition over many years where he goes from just believing God but yet organizing things around him in order to bring about God's promises to really just leaning into waiting to see what God's going to do to surprise him. It says that Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. And at that time, Canaanites were in the land. So they've been migrating. They get down far into the southeast. In fact, they're in the farthest north part of what we would know as the land of Canaan, Shechem. In fact, you can go right now when you get home, not right now, when you get home, you can go on YouTube and do a search for archaeological, I know you can't wait to do this, archaeological digs at Shechem. They've done a bunch of work digging out this ancient site of Shechem. It's right there. And Moses is telling them that Abram came as far as the great tree at Morah. That sounds so random to include this detail because 4,000 years later, that great tree is probably not there. But, in 2019, I had the opportunity to go to Israel. And one of the most impactful moments in that entire trip was we took a trip across the valley outside of the city of Jerusalem to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's an olive grove there. And there in the middle of the garden is this massive, thick, gnarled olive tree. And it stands out among all of the olive trees because of how big and thick it is. And the tour guide told us that the estimate is that this tree is 2,500 years old, which meant that at the time that Jesus prayed in the garden, this tree was here to witness it alongside him. And there was something so impactful to me to be standing next to this tree that Jesus stood next to. And I think what Moses is doing is saying to the Israelites who are sitting around the campfire, they came down the way, and they came as far as, the big tree that sits down the way over there, and they knew where he was talking about. And this tree is significant because what it represented to the people who lived there. In fact, this tree is known as the teacher's oak. And it provided a significant religious place for the Canaanites who lived in that land. They worshiped all kinds of gods, and they practiced prophecy and divination is what they would have called it. So this would have been a place where if you wanted to find out from the Canaanite gods, what are you going to do with us? You would invite a diviner to come to the teacher's oak and make a proclamation of what the gods were going to do on our behalf. Okay, so now you imagine this moment. Abram and his team are rolling up to the great teacher's oak. It makes me think of this section that comes later where Abram's grandson, Jacob, wrestles with God through the night. And he says this, surely the Lord is in this place and I just didn't know it. Because here the Lord appears to Abram and says, to your offspring I will give this land. I want you to imagine he's standing under this great tree, which has been used for all kinds of religious proclamations on false gods in this land. And here God appears to Abram and says, do you see this land? I'm going to give it to you. And then Abram does an incredible thing. Right there in the presence of these foreign gods and the worship that happens, he builds an altar and he claims that this is God's land. I love it. I love it. We see a progression of Abram's relationship with God too. This is the second time God has now spoken to Abram. Once he speaks, and this time, what does he do? He appears to him. And what we're going to see over Abram's life is an increasing intimacy and growing of relationship with Abram. Once a voice, now a presence, and Abram claims that when God appears, he overrides the order of the world. It doesn't matter who owns this land. It doesn't matter who the enemies are that are here. It doesn't matter what gods they claim to worship, because the God of the universe is here with me, and this is his land. One of the dangers that I have been wrestling with as we're working through Abraham is in order to make it applicable to your and my life, I want to immediately run to, and so therefore, how are you like Abraham? And here's the reality, and I say this with as much love as I can muster for you. You ain't Abraham. I'm not Abraham. God does things for people, and we can apply that generally to people, but we really want to avoid getting too cutesy with saying, and therefore, what God did from Abram, he's going to do for you. That's not what the Bible's saying. God's doing something unique here with Abram. But there are a few lessons that I think we can take away from him, and this is one of them. Where are you in your life? Where do you go where there is a competition for rule, for voice, for speaking over this area in which you get to go as one of the representatives of the people of God and claim God rules here in this place? Where is it in your country, in your tribe, in your community, in your workplace, in your home, in which you get to build metaphorical altars claiming God's rule over the place that you go and where you stand? This isn't a competitive claim for God's rule, it's just clarity. Because God is in charge whether it's acknowledged or not, and Abram is saying, I don't care what you got going on here, I want to declare what's true. God rules here, and he builds an altar. From there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he also built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. We're going to see Abram working his way through the land, and every place he stops, he builds an altar. He claims the name of God over this place because he's declaring God's authority to do with it as he pleases. That is our call in the world. We get to stand alongside Abram in that call. Because everywhere you go, as a Christian who's included in the family of God, you get to declare in that place, this also belongs to God. I'm here as a representative of him. He has sent me, and I'm laying claim to this place. Whether you like it, whether you acknowledge it, doesn't change the fact that God is still sovereign over it. Because this is what Abram is doing. Wherever he goes, he's claiming the rule of God over this place. And we do the same thing. Because God rules over all of creation. And then our section today ends with this. It's the most simple statement. Just a few words. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. He keeps going on his journey. He has not yet arrived. He doesn't know how it's going to happen. In fact, I don't want to completely spoil the story for you, but I'll give you a little hint. We're going to spend 10 weeks with Abram, and he never owns the land that God promises. So how is it that God can be faithful is the question. And the issue that I think we need to rest on as we sit here with Abram right at the end of this text is, what do we do to follow and obey God? And here's what I would say. Following the call of God just means taking the next step. So many times we want to know what God's plan for our life is. We want to know what God's will in. One of the things I've been talking to Shannon about planting this church in Tallahassee is there's a lot of unknowns when you're trying to plant a church in a new place. And of course, he would love God to give him the plan of how he's going to do everything and when he's going to move and how he's going to deliver. But he doesn't get that. All he gets is the call to trust God enough to take the next step. And that's true of you and of me. I don't know where you are in your life right now, but I do know that God is calling you in faithfulness to just take the next step, to just follow him one more day, to just go to the next place he's calling you to and wait on him to tell you where to go next. This is the beauty of faithfulness. We want to pray for clarity, we want to know, and we want to understand, but if you had clarity and if you knew the plan, it wouldn't be faith. And all he's asking you and all he was asking Abram is to take the next step in faithfulness and believe that God will deliver. Would you join me in praying that we would be a people who listen to our God and take steps of faith? God, thank you so much for the story of Abram. What an impactful one it is. God, we see how it has changed the course of the world. God, I pray that over this next 2.5 months or so that we spend with Abram, that we would get a picture of what you were doing in his life that would lay the pathway for the redemption of all things. God, the story of Jesus weaves directly through your calling of Abram. I pray that as we study his life and what you were doing, that we would be challenged to be faithful and to follow you in faith. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.